Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in session number 2 of our new series entitled Combating Bias in the Medical Legal Evaluation. And I have a fascinating discussion for you today, one that's going to take you from where you are today rapidly up into the future, wherein all qualified medical evaluations and all QME reports are free from bias and stereotyping, such that injured workers can receive fair and accurate benefits under the workers' compensation system, to which they are richly deserving and richly entitled to by law. So before we begin today's discussion, let's review the purpose of this entire program, which is to explain to you how the DWC's plan, we're going to get into the DWC's plan today, how the DWC's plan to combat bias in the medical legal evaluation. What is their plan? And I'll share with you that today step by step, their very elaborate plan, which encompasses the entire life cycle of the qualified medical evaluator. And then once that's established, we're going to talk about how that plan impacts the reporting of QMEs, and if you can understand how the DWC plans to impact your reporting by eliminating bias in your opinions and conclusions, then we can talk about how you can arrive at opinions and conclusions and write your reports in such a way that your reporting, that your opinions and conclusions, that your permanent impairment ratings and your apportionment determinations are free from bias, so that appropriate benefits can be provided for all persons. Now, in our very next session, just to give you a preamble as to where we're going, we're going to define bias, and I'm going to share with you many examples as to how bias exists in the California workers' compensation system. And this is going to open your eyes to some issues that you probably have never ever considered as a qualified medical evaluator. I know that when I started researching this topic, it blew my mind how subtle and pernicious and pervasive bias can be in the work that we do. So we have a big chore and a long road ahead of us in terms of being able to extricate biases and stereotypes, many of which have been in us since our infancy and childhood and reinforced by all of our life experiences, how we can reduce, eliminate, and even extricate stereotyping and biases from our opinions and conclusions, such that fair and accurate workers' compensation benefits can be provided for all persons, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of religious orientation, regardless of sexual preference, regardless of any discriminatory consideration that we may have that serves to unnecessarily and unfairly reduce workers' compensation benefits for any person. So that's our purpose, and let's just review where we've come from so far in this program before we get into today's discussion. Okay, so let's begin. And in our last session, session 1 of this program, we talked about what it was historically that served as the origin of the concern for bias in the medical legal evaluation. And we learned that the origin stemmed all the way back to approximately 2016 in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit. And Perry Soto, at the time, and still is, I believe at the time of this recording, Perry Soto is still the administrative director of the Division of Workers' Compensation. So at the time, the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit involved a group of women and also a large service industry, mostly in Southern California, who brought lawsuit against the Division of Workers' Compensation for what they described as gender bias in the opinions and conclusions of qualified medical evaluators. And they cited examples in this lawsuit, Page versus Perry Soto, that gender discrimination and gender bias was responsible for reducing workers' compensation benefits for not just Page, but for thousands and thousands of women throughout the state of California who were experiencing and suffering unnecessary reductions and unlawful reductions in their workers' compensation benefits on the basis of discriminatory, stereotyped, and biased opinions and conclusions from mostly male qualified medical evaluators. And the lawsuit seemed to have died in 2017 due to a jurisdiction issue, but the point that was raised in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit was well noted. It was well noted by the Division of Workers' Compensation. And now here in 2021, the Division of Workers' Compensation has now come around, and this has risen to the top of the to-do list at the division. And the division is now addressing this problem head on. So we talked about that in session 1. In today's session, I want to share with you exactly that, exactly what is the Division of Workers' Compensation's plan for eliminating bias from every aspect of the medical legal evaluation that we as qualified medical evaluators engage in hundreds and hundreds of times per day throughout the state of California. So they're going to take direct aim at the face-to-face evaluation. They're going to take direct aim at the QME report writing. They're going to take direct aim at the opinions and conclusions of the QME, and they're going to take direct aim at the bias issue by education, education, and education throughout the life cycle of the qualified medical evaluator. So let's take a look at the DWC's plans, and we'll talk about how those plans are going to impact your reporting and how you can adjust to the division's new plans to accomplish the end objective of the Division of Workers' Compensation. And I should share with you what their objective actually is. Their objective is actually to improve the system in which we as qualified medical evaluators participate. We are participants in the California Workers' Compensation system. And the Division of Workers' Compensation is charged with monitoring, managing, and improving the system, and their efforts now to eliminate bias and stereotyping from the evaluation in its totality is an effort in that direction. It's an effort to improve the system, and I agree with the division wholeheartedly. I see this as a positive step into the future that will infinitely improve the content and certainly the accuracy of our reporting. So let's take a look at the Division of Workers' Compensation's big plans to help us in this objective. So here we are in 2021, and the Division of Workers' Compensation is now, for the first time in all of reported history, now taking a large, overt, and active, visible step to reduce bias in the medical legal evaluation. Well, this may not come as a new concept to you if you've been paying attention to the media, if you've been paying attention to advertising, if you've been paying attention to shifts in social cultures and social attitudes. You'll realize that efforts to combat bias, discrimination, and stereotyping have been ongoing for years and decades. And since I began researching this program, I've become more sensitive to bias and efforts to combat bias throughout society. So as an example, I was shopping just the other day at the sporting goods store, at Dick's Sporting Goods store, and I went to use the men's room, and I saw this poster posted on both the men's and ladies' room doors, the doors to the men's room and the door to the ladies' room. And it talks about Dick's Sporting Goods position on bias, stereotyping, discrimination, and racism. And their policy is, we do not accept racism or discrimination of any kind. Well, what does that have to do with our discussion? Well, the Division of Workers' Compensation is taking a similar stance to Dick's Sporting Goods, where they're no longer going to tolerate any of these negative attitudes, negative opinions and conclusions in our reports, because bias, stereotyping, and discrimination have the unintended effect, the unintended impact of reducing benefits for injured workers or providing for inaccurate benefits that are not accurate. Now, the purpose of our qualified medical evaluation reports is to provide opinions and conclusions that are accurate. And when there's bias, when there's stereotyping, when there's discrimination involved in our reports can in no way, it's impossible for our reports to be accurate. And accuracy is the order of the day in the opinions and conclusions of the qualified medical evaluator. So the Division of Workers' Compensation has a plan, and here is the plan. And what you're going to see is that this plan is fascinating, and this plan encompasses the entire lifespan of the qualified medical evaluator, beginning here even before the qualified medical evaluator sits for the QME competency evaluation. There is a plan in place that prospective qualified medical evaluators will need to confirm their eligibility to sit for the examination by proving and demonstrating that they've completed training in anti-bias, training. That's even before the qualified medical evaluator can sit for the competency examination. Then, once the qualified medical evaluator receives his or her credential and begins to do QME work, there's a plan in place to eliminate bias in the face-to-face evaluation. There's a plan to eliminate bias in the opinions and conclusions of each and every report authored by each and every qualified medical evaluator. There's a plan in place to ensure that we as qualified medical evaluators receive ongoing training in issues related to bias, stereotyping, and discrimination in the face-to-face evaluation. So let's take a look at these steps and these educational measures one at a time. Okay, now, before a qualified medical evaluator can sit for the QME competency exam, the qualified medical evaluator prospect will have to go through some pre-QME training, which is described in CCR 11.5, subsection 4, which talks about instruction in anti-bias training, which meets the qualifications such as what we're going to go over now. First of all, the anti-bias training must be a minimum of at least 2 hours and must contain some of the following exact types of instruction. So number one, it must include instruction that is designed to increase awareness and understanding of differences in human experience, as well as awareness of implicit or unconscious bias. And we'll define those in our next session. Stereotyping and discrimination, and the ways in which these problems, such as unconscious bias, can unintentionally impact perceptions and decision-making. Decision-making of who? Of who? We're talking here about the decision-making of the QME in the opinions and conclusions of the report, including in medical evaluations and reporting, and can lead to disparities in healthcare strategies, the purpose of which is to help eliminate or reduce implicit bias in medical evaluations and reporting, such that that reporting can be more accurate. The purpose of all of these changes is to improve the accuracy of the QME's report. Okay, what other type of training is going to be required in this minimum 2 hours of pre-QME training? Well, the training must include at least one example of potential gender bias in a fictitious QME evaluation in which an apportionment rating is made based on an assumption about a risk factor related solely to the injured worker's gender. And this was the issue that was raised in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit, that women were having their permanent impairment ratings and their disability awards unlawfully apportioned based on male stereotypes of risk factors related to the female gender or related to female reproductive biology. So this is a direct result of the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit. Finally, the training must include at least one example relating to an evaluation and rating of permanent disability resulting from industrial breast cancer, taking into account the ways in which gender bias could potentially impact an assessment of the impairment that results from breast cancer and its treatment. In other words, treatment for breast cancer and the effects that can linger in a woman who has been treated for breast cancer. And again, this is a direct result of the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit. And we talked about that in our last session, and we showed that women were being given permanent impairment ratings of as low as 0% to 1% to only as high as 5% whole person impairment for double mastectomy procedures. And this is a problem with the AMA guides, in that the AMA guides do not provide much in the way of an impairment rating for single mastectomy and even double mastectomy. And women argued that not only were the AMA guides not accurate and they were discriminatory on the basis of gender bias, but also qualified medical evaluators were not sensitive to the issues that women experience. Women who have undergone treatment for breast cancer many times are left with impairing sequelae that aren't directly addressed by the AMA guides, and for which they receive very, very low impairment ratings, which are not an accurate representation of their true losses. So these issues are going to be directly addressed in the pre-QME training before qualified medical evaluators can even sit for the QME evaluation. Okay? So let's say the qualified medical evaluator completes the pre-QME training in bias, and the prospect gets his or her QME credential and then goes on to start participating in QME evaluations. Well, the division has a plan for that scenario as well. So at the face-to-face evaluation, the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to begin putting new attention on what is already an existing regulation, California Code of Regulation 40, which has long been known as the disclosure requirements. But the division has realized that many qualified medical evaluators do not properly go through the disclosure requirements with each and every examinee, which is required by law. It's required by law, but many qualified medical evaluators are not aware of this, or they simply neglect to perform this procedure. And this procedure involves you as the qualified medical evaluator advising the injured worker at the face-to-face evaluation. At the time of the actual evaluation, you as the qualified medical evaluator sit down with the examinee before you begin and advise them that they, as the injured worker, they may discontinue the evaluation at any time based on good cause. So what's good cause? Good cause includes any feeling that the examinee gets that you as the qualified medical evaluator may be discriminatory towards them based on something such as their race, such as their sex, such as their national origin, such as their religious orientation, such as their sexual preference, or if you as the qualified medical evaluator engage in any behavior that can be even remotely construed by the injured worker as abusive behavior, as hostile behavior, as rude behavior, or any type of behavior that demonstrates a bias against what? Against even injured workers themselves, regardless of their race, sex, national origin. Some injured workers feel that qualified medical evaluators are prejudiced and biased against them simply because they were injured in the course of their workplace duties. And so it's long been held in law, CCR 40, that injured workers don't have to put up with this. They have an out clause as provided to them under CCR 40. This is their out clause if they feel that you as the qualified medical evaluator are not going to give them a fair shake, free from bias, free from stereotyping, and free from discrimination for any reason. So the Division of Workers' Compensation is taking a new and harder and closer look at this requirement for qualified medical evaluators to actually prove that they have completed this procedure with each and every evaluation, such that each and every examinee is fully apprised of their legal rights under the law to either proceed or discontinue with the evaluation based upon the qualified medical evaluator's conduct. So that's the face-to-face evaluation, and that's good. That's going to help shake up the qualified medical evaluator and ensure that the qualified medical evaluator behaves properly during the face-to-face evaluation. What else? How else can the Division of Workers' Compensation wrestle our stereotypes and our biases out of the core of our very being throughout the evaluation process? Well, the division is going to require ongoing education in anti-bias training. So currently, the continuing education requirements for qualified medical evaluators involves 12 hours of continuing education every 2 years, which is a tiny, tiny requirement. That's tiny. Some would argue that that's about right, or that that's an excessive requirement. In my opinion, that's a tiny, inadequate requirement. And the Division of Workers' Compensation is considering increasing the continuing education requirement. But to whatever extent the division decides to increase the continuing education hour requirement, they are going to be including an additional 2 hours of this mandatory topic of anti-bias training, which meets the qualifications outlined in Regulation 11, which we described earlier, related to the pre-QME training. So the training in different persons' experiences, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and gender discrimination related to apportionment, and then also breast cancer issues. So this is going to have to be repeated by qualified medical evaluators every 2 years to keep the concept fresh in the mind of qualified medical evaluators. So between those 2-year periods, the division is going to keep the concept fresh in each and every report that we offer by requiring that each and every report contain a mandatory declaration. The mandatory declaration. Now, this is described in new law, CCR 35.5H, which tells us that each reporting evaluator shall include in the report a declaration under penalty of perjury. I, Perry J. Carpenter, DC, QME, declare under penalty of perjury that I did not discriminate in any way against the parties to the action, meaning the applicant attorney, the defense attorney, the claims administrator, okay, or the injured worker in the evaluation process or in the content of the report. So this mandatory declaration is going to have the effect of requiring us as QMEs to stop for a moment, think for a moment, and review our reports and confirm that our reports and the opinions and conclusions in those reports are free from bias, are free from discrimination, are free from stereotyping, such that those opinions and conclusions in each and every report are forever pushed closer and closer and closer to accurate opinions and conclusions, not confounded and confused by all these overlapping issues related to bias. Finally, for those qualified medical evaluators who just can't seem to get this in their head, who have difficulty with this issue, have difficulty being objective, difficulty being neutral, difficulty being sensitive to bias issues related to race, sex, national origin, religious preference, sexual orientation, or any of the parties to the action, the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to have to remove those bad weeds and bad apples from the system by denying reappointment to the bad apple QMEs. If it's been shown that the QME has failed to render expert opinions or conclusions without regard to an injured worker's race, sexual, national origin, religion, or sexual preference, then those QMEs will be very quickly weeded out from the system. So these measures, as you can see, encompass the entire life cycle of the qualified medical evaluator, from even before the prospect sits for the QME competency evaluation, all the way through years and decades with ongoing training every 2 years, and anti-bias training, anti-bias training, anti-bias training. Drive this issue in, drive it home, drive it through our thick skulls, so that by the time that we finally retire and declare ourselves unavailable, the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to be constantly at us to ensure that our opinions and conclusions are accurate, and in my opinion, that's a very, very good thing. So doctors, I hope this helps you, and what I suggest is you can begin your own anti-bias training boot camp right now. You can go on your own bias, stereotyping, and discrimination weight loss diet right now. So what can you do? Well, I would suggest at least 3 things. Number 1, you can read the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit. The Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit is a tremendous document. It's a tremendous learning opportunity for us as qualified medical evaluators. And as you go through the claims of these injured female workers, you're going to have your mind blown, which is what happened to me. My mind was blown as they raised issues and considerations that I had never even considered as a qualified medical evaluator. And the issues that they raised in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit are very legitimate and point to shortcomings and failings not only in the AMA guides, which has many failings and shortcomings. I'm sure you'll agree with that. I myself have found dozens of inconsistencies in the AMA guides, and permanent impairment ratings, certainly at least related to breast cancer, are not adequately addressed in the AMA guides. So there's shortcomings and failings with the AMA guides, but also with us as qualified medical evaluators because of our ingrained, implicit, and unconscious biases that have been in us our whole lives. So the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit will help you tremendously to introduce the concept of bias in the medical legal evaluation to you. So that's one thing I suggest. Number 2 is to take the disclosure requirements under CCR 40, the disclosure requirements, and print those out on a piece of paper. And you can hand this piece of paper to your injured worker examinee before you begin the face-to-face evaluation. And when the injured worker has finished reading their rights under CCR 40, you interactively discuss their rights with them and let them know that if at any time they don't feel comfortable during the evaluation, they feel that the evaluator is weird, is rude, is abusive, is hostile, or has any kind of discriminatory conduct, that they don't have to put up with that and they can leave, and that you gain an agreement from the injured worker that they don't have to put up with anything that makes them even remotely feel uncomfortable. And this will help you as the qualified medical evaluator to turn your attention quickly to your behavior during the face-to-face evaluation, because the goal is to get to a completed evaluation with the injured worker with you, with the injured worker with you, such that the injured worker trusts you and such that the injured worker can provide you with an accurate history and with accurate testimony and with an accurate performance on physical examination. Because again, accuracy is the whole driver behind this initiative. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is you can take the new mandatory declaration, install that into the end of your report where all your other mandatory declarations are, which is right above the signature line in your report. Install that mandatory declaration there, highlight it in yellow, underline it, and put it in bold. And before you sign that report and pop that report in the mail, that yellow highlighting will capture your attention and will cause you to think, and to confirm that the opinions and conclusions that you offered in those last several pages of your report are accurate, and are free from bias, and are free from stereotyping, and are free from discrimination based upon the major targets: race, sex, national origin, religious preference, and sexual orientation. And by going through that mandatory declaration exercise, you can be confident that when you put that report in the mail, that the opinions and conclusions of that report are accurate. Okay? So doctors, I hope that helps you. In our next session, we're going to define bias. We're going to define all these terms that are now described in the QME regulations, such as implicit bias, unconscious bias, stereotype, and we're going to define those. And I'm going to share with you several sources that evidence bias in the medical legal evaluation, where injured workers have been treated poorly, unlawfully, and inaccurately, unobjectively, unneutrally, if that's even a word, have been treated badly based upon these unconscious and implicit biases. And this is going to blow your mind, because there's not just one example, there's hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of those, and I'll share with you some of the more compelling examples of those. And then later in other sessions, in our next few sessions, I'm going to give you a series of steps where you can step by step take your opinions and conclusions through a series of algorithms, a series of medical decision-making bias choke points, where if your opinions and conclusions can pass through those choke points, you can be assured and confident that your report is free from bias of any type. So this is something that's going to help you tremendously in each and every future report that you author throughout your career as a qualified medical evaluator. So doctors, I hope this helps you. This is a big issue these days, and this is something that you're going to be hearing much more of throughout your career. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on this very important discussion. I look forward to being with you on future discussions as well. And for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.